Hello, this is Brad Carmack, the author of Homosexuality, A Straight BYU Student's Perspective. This is part 3, and in parts 1 and 2 we explored the question of what causes homosexuality. We're still exploring the answer to that question. We're going to take a look at about 15 more parking lots or different areas that bear on this question. We've looked in part 1 at twin studies, and we looked at gay hands, kind of looking at the second to fourth digit ratio of the hand and how those are different between men and women. We've looked at a number of other gender shifted attributes between the homosexually oriented and the heterosexually oriented population, such as voice quality and gait. We just got finished talking about the boarding school effect on whether or not boarding schools increase the incidence of homosexual orientation. We're going to go ahead and get started now with systemic cultural molestation. So there are some cultures in the world that in order to kind of go through the normal routine of being a child and adolescent before you reach adulthood are required to engage in homosexual conduct with adult men, and usually is the way that it works. In New Guinea there's a tribe, the Sambia tribe, and the idea there is that ingesting semen helps to improve your vitality. And so the teenage young men there all go through molestation as teenagers. Now the theory that molestation, affection, and choice affects homosexual orientation would predict that in that particular culture you would have a lot higher incidence of homosexual orientation as adults. The results there are not clear. What we do know is that as adults those men marry and behave heterosexually, but since our inquiry is more focused on homosexual orientation, we can't read too much into that, although some would say it is a strong indicator. Let's go ahead and move on to homosexual orientation as a subset of gender socialization. Many who kind of decry the biological determinism sort of aspect would say, well, say for instance gender. We have biological sex, but superimposed upon that matrix is the psychology of gender. And so perhaps homosexual orientation is nothing more than a psychological reality. I think most scholars would likely consider that to be a sexual identity. What one kind of reports that was also sort of like gender is psychology superimposed upon the biology of sex. I would say your sexual identity is superimposed on the matrix, the underlying matrix that is your sexual orientation. But in any case, you could look to answer this question at some boys, physical like that are have the genes and genitalia of men that are socialized as women. Indeed, there are across cultures there have been a number of children that have been culturized to be a different gender than they are. Genetic males, for instance, that are reassigned as females while they're babies. Sometimes that happens, for instance, when there's a congenital malformation of the pelvic area. They report when they reach adulthood being attracted to females, despite the fact that they were assigned to be females themselves and were culturally raised that way and encouraged to be female. Let's go ahead and take a look at another parking lot. Again, the idea with the parking lots is if you say that the parking lot is, the car is in lot A and I say it's in lot B, if we both walk out together, they're both lots A and B, we can see where the car is and where the car is not. So the two theories that we have on trial here today is one, that homosexual orientation is caused by molestation and or infection or being recruited and or choice of the individual. The other theory is that homosexual orientation is predominantly caused by genes and prenatal hormones. It's more of a biological reality. So let's go ahead and take a look at homosexual orientation being the product of your parents' orientation. The idea is if you're, you can be acculturized or kind of catch kind of like a cold homosexual orientation. Perhaps if your mother or father is homosexually oriented, then you will be homosexually oriented as well. And those those families where both the mother and the father or the parents are straight, the children will be straight. Well, what do we observe? The vast majority of homosexually oriented people have straight parents. And there's been a number of studies that look at children raised by homosexually oriented parents, and it turns out that those children do not differ in their sexual orientation from children raised by straight parents. There's a small exception that applies to the female biological children of lesbians. Okay, so that's a parking lot. In my book, again, which is available for you at bradcarmack.blogspot.com, if you're following along, that was parking lot 17. Parking lot 18 looks at choice. course, the theory A that we're looking at would say that those that choose to be homosexual oriented, that's basically what causes their orientation, is just a simple choice. Similarly, the kind of converse of that would be that those who are straight choose to be so. Certainly gives credence to the idea that homosexual oriented people are deviants and that they're born straight but choose to be homosexually oriented. Well, the way to kind of tease out the answer to that question is to perform a survey and to ask individuals whether choice played a role, since under the assumption that we're generally aware of our choices, only 4% of gay men and 15% of lesbian women say that choice had anything to do with why they're homosexually oriented. And it's not really sure how that compares to the heterosexual norm of responding to the same questions. I'm not aware of surveys that have asked those same questions of a random sample. So it doesn't look like we have a whole lot conclusive from that inquiry, but some individuals would argue that it's sort of a common sense of asking heterosexual-oriented people when they chose to be straight and asking homosexual-oriented people when they chose to be gay would tell the observer that choice doesn't play a role in homosexual orientation, although we know that some people seem to be reporting some role of agency in their homosexual orientation. The next parking lot we're going to look at is the comparison to animals. Some take a look at animals as a basis of comparison, since so much of our genes and biology are the same, and ask the question about whether there is homosexual orientation in animals. Now, up to now, most of our studies have compared the heterosexual to the homosexual population in regards to their orientation based on self-report. That's going to be more difficult with the animals, since they can't self-report. The only indicator we have for their orientation is going to be their behavior. So what do we observe in the animal kingdom? About 1,500 species of animals engage in homosexual behavior, courtship, and indeed pair bonds. It's well documented for 500 of those 1,500 species. A few examples: about 8% of male rams behave only homosexually. Turns out if you take a look at their brains, the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the medial preoptic area for the gay sheep is about half the size of that in straight sheep. A few other examples. There's one report that 9 out of 10 giraffe pairings occur between males. In some penguin species, the same-sex individuals mate for life and refuse to mate with females even when they have the opportunity. Many other species follow similar patterns: gulls, mallards, dolphins, elephants, lions, bison, bonobos, and hyenas, to name a few. There's an anecdote of a pair of penguins, Roy and Silo. They met in a zoo holding tank in 1998 in New York Central Park. They became inseparable, built a nest, defended it from others, and engaged in what the zookeepers euphemistically call ecstatic display. They showed signs of wanting to be parents, so the zookeepers gave them a dummy egg at first. When they successfully incubated the dummy egg, they gave them an actual egg. When the baby chick was born, Roy and Silo cared for it, fed it, kept it warm, and successfully launched it into maturity. Years later, the couple is still going strong and is regarded just as another couple by the surrounding heterosexual penguin peers. Also, earlier we had discussed sexual determination. There's a experiment done with some rats where some of the mothers of rats were given an endocrine disruptor, and a control group was given no endocrine disruptor. And the sons of these rat moms that had the endocrine disruptor engage in homosexual behavior as adults, whereas the sons of the mothers that were not given the endocrine disruptor displayed normal heterosexual behavior. Well, it's well known that rats and mice share a lot of genes and, in fact, a lot of diseases with humans. That's why they're so often used for experimenting with new drugs. So the theory of molestation, infection, and choice would predict that the animals probably would not have a lot of homosexual orientation because they're not subject to influences like molestation and infection, and don't exhibit as much choice or agency as we typically associate with being human. But we do observe a number of species of animals that engage in homosexual conduct, and sometimes for the same reasons, including exposure to endocrine disruptors, which have about the same effect in humans as they do in rats, which is not surprising given the similarities of our biology. Okay, so that was a look at homosexuality in animals. Let's go ahead and talk now about CAH. It stands for congenital adrenal hyperplasia. CAH. And it refers to sort of any condition that comes from a mutation of genes that help cortisol be produced from cholesterol by the adrenal glands. So typically what that means is that there's a little bit too much of the steroid hormones like testosterone, progesterone, and estrogens during development. As you may remember from the sex determination primer, that the dosage and timing of hormones during fetal development is vital to the sex determination of the fetus. Again, the default embryo for humans is female. In order to successfully become a male in all stereotypical male ways, a number of steps have to go right, including the right dosages and timings of sex steroid hormones. So again, the molestation infection choice would say that homosexual orientation is mostly caused by non-biological factors. So whether you have congenital adrenal hyperplasia or not will not be a good predictor of whether or not you would report being homosexually oriented compared to being heterosexual oriented. The biological theory would predict sort of the opposite, again based on the idea that prenatal hormones account for a lot of the variability in homosexual orientation. What do we observe? No less than 19 studies evidence that congenital adrenal hyperplasia women are on average very significantly shifted in the direction of homosexual orientation. Okay. Now we're going to take a turn and look a little bit about some studies that bear on hearing in the ears. Turns out the cochlea not only hears and registers sounds, it also makes sounds in addition to sensing them. These are called otoacoustic emissions, or OAEs. If you put a sensitive microphone inside the ear, you can detect these frequencies. Any particular person will have between about 0 and a dozen different OAEs. Now, women on average are different than men in regards to their OAE. So again, the question is there a difference between the homosexual-oriented population of men and the heterosexual-oriented population of men when it comes to these auditory pathways? The molestation, infection, and choice probably wouldn't predict much. Why would one's orientation or choice, or whether you're molested or not, have any sort of correlation to the sounds made by the cochlea in the ear? The biological theory, on the other hand, would predict that you would observe differences, again, because of the gender shifting of the sex determination that's caused by the genes and prenatal hormones during fetal development. Well, what do we observe? Homosexual-oriented men are not different from heterosexual-oriented men. However, the women are shifted, and it's again in the direction that we've seen in the past. Homosexual-oriented women are gender shifted towards the heterosexual male norm in regards to their otoacoustic emissions. Now, also in regards to the ear, let's kind of tag this along. There's the pre-pulse inhibition, which is sort of the response to a large sound stimulus, like you're normally kind of startled when you hear a large sound. Well, this is a non-learned behavior, and it differs between men and women. Again, you can kind of tease this out and say, is there a difference between the homosexually compared to the heterosexually oriented subpopulations of each gender? What do we observe? Homosexual women do manifest a significantly masculinized, gender shifted towards the heterosexual male norm of the pre-pulse inhibition. The next parking lot we'll look at, and again, if you're following along in my book, it's parking lot 22. We're going to take a look at DES exposure. So DES is a chemical. It's also known as an endocrine disruptor. It's used to treat conditions such as breast and prostate cancer. And for a while, it was given to pregnant women, believing that it would reduce their risk of pregnancy complications. DES is an estrogen mimic. Again, the molestation, infection, and choice theory would predict that estrogen mimics are not going to have an effect on homosexual orientation because the variability in homosexual orientation isn't attributable to biological factors such as prenatal hormones. It's attributable to whether or not you were molested, and whether or not you chose to be homosexual oriented, and whether or not you were around other homosexual oriented people and were infected by their orientation. So, out of 30 women that were exposed to DES, 24% reported a lifelong bisexual or homosexual orientation. Now again, these are the children of mothers who were exposed to DES, meaning that the fetus in the womb was exposed to this estrogen mimic. Also, we need to look at sister pairs where one sister had been exposed in the womb to DES and the other hadn't, same mom, different time period of gestation. 8% of the unexposed sisters reported a lifelong bisexual orientation, while 42% of the exposed sisters reported a lifelong bisexual orientation. So it seems that estrogen mimics can affect the orientation of an individual. And again, this is the presence or absence of the correct dosage of a hormone or prenatal hormone during the development of the fetus. Okay. Let's go ahead and take a look at another parking lot. This is 23, the question of whether or not homosexual orientation runs in families, which would be suggestive of the biological origin, mostly along the genetic lines, since that's the most common element amongst families, besides their some environmental norms. What would we observe and what would we predict? Well, the biological theory, which again from the twin studies is about 25% of the variability in homosexual orientation, is due to heritable factors. The only ones which we know of are genes. Would predict that you would see a small correlation with homosexual orientation running in families. And indeed, that is what we observed. Gay men are about 3 times more likely to have gay brothers than heterosexual men, and lesbians have more lesbian sisters than the general population. Okay, now you may remember when we looked at CAH, congenital adrenal hyperplasia. We're going to look at a sort of a similar disorder known as androgen insensitivity syndrome. Androgen insensitivity syndrome, it's AIS. So what this symptom is caused by is the gene that encodes the protein receptor that mediates testosterone is mutant. So it means the fetus can't respond to testosterone in the womb. So it seems like there's not enough testosterone there. Even though it's present, the receptor is not functioning normally. What would we predict if there's not enough testosterone being received by the fetus? It's going to stay more in the default female embryo, not completely, but more so than those that don't have that mutation. So we would think they would have more often than default sexual orientation, which again is towards men. What do we observe? Exactly that. Androgen insensitivity syndrome men uniformly exhibit a sexual attraction towards men. Okay, these last 7 parking lots I'm going to lump together. We're going to take a look at the brain. This could be the most important set of parking lots that we visited on this tour. Kind of saved the best for last here. Now we know that brains are plastic in some ways until about age 25, and of course to the extent that we continue to learn throughout our lives, they're plastic throughout the lifespan. However, most of the structural aspects of the brain are static, and they're measurably different for men and women by only a few months after birth or postpartum. So, if we know that on average girl brains and boy brains are different, again this is a gender difference between men and women, we can tease out, is there a difference between the homosexual-oriented population of men and the heterosexual-oriented population of men, and the same question for women. So we're going to take a look at these differences along a number of metrics of the brain. What do we observe when we do this test? Well, there are a number of studies which indicate that the relative size of the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, which is again different for men and women, is gender shifted for homosexual-oriented men in the direction of the heterosexual female norm. Also, both gay men and lesbian women are gender shifted towards the opposite gender in the responses of their brain to compounds thought to be sex pheromones. Okay, so if you expose their brains to sex pheromones, they are gender shifted in that they respond more like the opposite gender. Gay males, like females, have better verbal abilities than straight males. That part of the brain that helps control verbal fluency. Both gay men and lesbian women are gender shifted towards the opposite gender in the functional connectivity of their amygdalas. That's the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions. And you can measure that by cerebral blood flow. So gay and lesbian women are gender shifted towards the opposite gender in the functional connectivity of their amygdalas. Also, the isthmus of the corpus callosum, and we know that the heritability factor for the size of that isthmus is 94%, meaning that the variability in the size of that isthmus is accounted for by genes, 94% of that variability. That's a typical causation test. So again, this is a very, very heritable factor, and there is a difference between heterosexual and homosexual men in the size of the isthmus of the corpus callosum. And again, this is something that's relatively static by a few months after birth and is in fact measurable at that time, from what I understand. Also, viewing a female face produced a strong reaction in the thalamus and the medial prefrontal cortex of straight men, but not of gay men. So the gay male brains are reacting more strongly to the face of a man than a woman, and the brains of the heterosexual males responding more to the face of a woman than a man. So that's a gender shift for the homosexual-oriented population. There's a structure in the brain called the anterior commissure. It's the super fast cables that connect the brain hemispheres, the left and the right. That cable is larger in gay men compared to straight men on average. Also, we know that gay men are gender shifted in the size and density of the third interstitial nucleus of the hypothalamus. This is a sexually dimorphic cell group, meaning it's different again for men and women, and it's concerned with male typical sexual behavior. So gay men are gender shifted in the size and density of the third interstitial nucleus of the hypothalamus, meaning that gay men brains are gender shifted away from heterosexual male brains and look more like homosexually and heterosexually oriented female brains, more specifically gender shifted towards the heterosexual female norm in those areas. So that concludes our parking lot test. Again, the idea of going out and looking at gender differences, teasing out some of the differences, if they exist, between the homosexual-oriented and heterosexual-oriented population in an attempt to answer the question of what causes homosexuality, putting on trial the idea that molestation, infection, and or choice are primarily responsible for homosexual orientation, versus the idea that mostly genes and prenatal hormones account for the variability in homosexual orientation. I'll let you make your own conclusions as to which theory the data best support.